Welcome to the Lore Weaver podcast, a space for deep dive literary analysis, character studies, and thematic readings across fantasy, historical fiction, and speculative worlds. Here we look beyond surface level takes and popular shorthand to examine what the text is actually doing, how power works, how belief shapes outcomes, and how characters are flattened or misunderstood over time. Let's get into today's topic. One of the greatest ironies in A Song of Ice and Fire is that the truest knights in the series are two characters who technically are not knights at all. One of them is Duncan the Tall, a hedge knight from Flea Bottom. After Sir Arlen of Pennytree dies, Dunk simply takes up his armor and shield and begins presenting himself as Sir Duncan the Tall. George R.R. Martin would even say that Dunk was never formally knighted, which adds another layer to the character. The man who spends his life trying to live up to the ideals of knighthood was never actually knighted. The other is Brienne of Tarth, a daughter of a lord who has the training, the skill, and the resources to be a knight, but who can never legally be one simply because she is a woman. And yet these two characters embody the ideal of knighthood more consistently than most of the men in Westeros who actually carry the title lawfully. Martin has confirmed that Brienne is descended from Dunk, but the connection between them goes far beyond genealogy. Brienne doesn't just inherit Dunk's bloodline, she inherits his role in the story. Both characters exist outside the institution of knighthood, but they repeatedly demonstrate what knighthood is supposed to mean. In a world full of knights who fail their vows, Dunk and Brienne stand out because they keep trying to live by them, even at the risk of their own safety. Martin presents knighthood as something with two very different realities. The first reality is that of the fairy tale ideal, the version celebrated in songs and stories. Daenerys Targaryen describes this romantic vision of knighthood when she says this: "In my 7 kingdoms, knights go on quests to prove themselves worthy of the maiden that they love. They seek for magic swords, for chests of gold, for crowns stolen from a dragon's hoard." This is the version of knighthood that many characters grow up believing in. Gallant warriors riding on noble quests, defending the innocent, winning glory, and being indisputably men, while women exist as victims to protect or hearts to win. Brienne herself also believes in this version of the world. In A Clash of Kings, she tells Catelyn Stark, "In the songs, all knights are gallant, all maids are beautiful, and the sun is always shining." But Martin repeatedly contrasts this ideal with the institutional reality of knighthood. Even Barristan Selmy, one of the most honorable knights in the entire series, admits that he spent much of his life serving alongside men who disgraced the vows they had sworn, and even he had forsworn the vows he made to protect Daenerys and Viserys, who struggled in Essos while he continued to serve Robert Baratheon. After he reveals himself to Daenerys in A Storm of Swords, this is the exchange they have. "Why are you here?" Dany demanded of him. "If Robert sent you to kill me, why did you save my life? He served the usurper. He betrayed Rhaegar's memory and abandoned Viserys to live and die in exile. Yet if he wanted me dead, he need only have stood aside. I want the whole truth now. On your honor as a knight, are you the usurper's man or mine?" "Yours, if you will have me." Sir Barristan had tears in his eyes. "I took Robert's pardon. I served him in King's Guard and Council, served with the Kingslayer and others near as bad, who soiled the white cloak I wore. Nothing will excuse that. I might be serving in King's Landing still if the vile boy upon the Iron Throne had not cast me aside. It shames me to admit. But when he took the cloak that the White Bull draped about my shoulders and sent men to kill me that self-same day, it was as though he'd ripped a caul off my eyes. That was when I knew I must find my true king and die in his service." Barristan believes deeply in the ideals of knighthood, yet he recognizes that the institution often fails to live up to those ideals, as proven not only with Jaime Lannister, but with himself. Knighthood is not just a moral code, it is also a social and economic institution. A knight must be able to afford armor, weapons, a war horse, training, and often the support of a noble or knightly household. For many in Westeros, those barriers make knighthood impossible, even if they possess the courage and honor that the role is supposed to represent. Both Duncan the Tall and Brienne of Tarth exist outside the institution of knighthood, but for very different reasons. Dunk is a poor boy from Fleabottom who grew up with almost nothing. He cannot read, he struggles with courtly behavior, and even after he begins traveling as Sir Duncan the Tall, he remains painfully aware of how little he understands about the world of knights and nobles. His size and strength make him impressive in battle, but socially he is awkward and uncertain, often worrying that others will discover how out of place he is. He also lacks formal training as a knight and has to rely on his physical strength rather than on technical skill. So despite the fact that he was never formally knighted, Dunk believes deeply in what knighthood is supposed to mean. The lessons he remembers from Sir Arlen are not about tournaments or glory, but about honor. As he explains during the trial at Ashford, "A knight defends the innocent," he said. "That's all I did." For Dunk, knighthood is not just about titles and prestige, it's about protecting people who cannot protect themselves. Brienne's situation is almost the opposite. She has the wealth, the training, that should make knighthood accessible to her. As the daughter of Lord Selwyn Tarth, she grew up in a castle, trained with weapons, and learned the skills that knights are expected to possess. But Brienne faces a barrier Dunk never does. She is a woman. Because of that, she can never be formally knighted, no matter how skilled or honorable she proves herself to be. Instead, she is mocked for her appearance, ridiculed by men who treat her as a joke, and excluded from the culture of chivalry she desperately wants to belong to. That's one of the great ironies of Brienne as well. She actually wants to be a fair maiden from the songs, but her height and her physical appearance bar her from that. Whenever she wears a dress, she's mocked. Whenever she wears armor, she's mocked. She wants to be a knight, she wants to be a maiden, but she's mocked for both. Despite their different backgrounds, Dunk and Brienne ultimately arrive at the same understanding of what knighthood truly means. For Dunk, this realization comes during the trial of 7 at Ashford Meadow in the Hedge Knight. After defending the puppet girl Tanselle from Prince Arian's cruelty, Dunk finds himself facing 7 powerful knights who are willing to stand with the prince rather than defend the innocent. Desperate, Dunk rides before the viewing stand and calls out to the assembled knights, "Are there no true knights among you?" The knights remained silent. Then Prince Baelor Targaryen stepped forward and agreed to fight beside Dunk, explaining his reasoning with a simple statement that captures the heart of Martin's definition of knighthood. This man protected the weak, as every true knight must. Brienne arrives at the same conclusion years later in A Feast for Crows. By this point in the story, she has traveled through the countryside devastated by war and witnessed countless examples of knights failing to live up to their vows. When she hears about the atrocities committed at the salt pans and the knight who refused to defend the townspeople, she rejects the excuses offered for his inaction. Instead, she insists that a knight's duty is clear. Old or young, a knight is sworn to protect those who are weaker than himself or die in the attempt. The definition Brienne gives is almost identical to the one Dunk learned from Sir Arlen. A true knight is not about titles, wealth, or noble birth. It is about moral action. A true knight protects the innocent, even when it is dangerous, even when it is inconvenient, and even when no one is willing to stand beside them. No chance and no choice. One of the clearest parallels between Duncan the Tall and Brienne of Tarth appears in 2 moments that follow almost the exact same structure. In both scenes, the character understands that intervening is dangerous. In both scenes, they know they shouldn't get involved. And in both scenes, they step forward anyway. In The Hedge Knight, Dunk is told by Egg that Prince Arian Targaryen is attacking the puppet girl Tanselle. Dunk is warned not to interfere by Raymond Fosway, who reminds him exactly who Arian is. "Sir Duncan, Arian," he said, "a prince of the blood, be careful." It was good counsel, he knew. The old man would have said the same, but he could not listen. He wrenched free of Raymond's hand and shouldered his way out of the pavilion. He could hear shouting off in the direction of the Merchant's Row. Egg was almost out of sight. Dunk ran after him. His legs were long and the boys were short. He quickly closed the distance. A wall of watchers had gathered around the puppeteers. Dunk shouldered through them, ignoring their curses. A man-at-arms in the royal livery stepped up to block him. Dunk put a big hand on his chest and shoved, sending the man flailing backwards, to sprawl on his arse in the dirt. The puppeteer's stall had been knocked on its side. The fat Dornish woman was on the ground weeping. One man-at-arms was dangling the puppets of Florian and Jonquil from his hands as another set them afire with a torch. 3 more men were opening chests, spilling more puppets on the ground, and stamping on them. The dragon puppet was scattered all about them, a broken wing here, its head there, its tail in 3 pieces. And in the midst of it all stood Prince Arion, resplendent in red velvet doublet with long, dagged sleeves, twisting Tanzel's arm in both hands. She was on her knees, pleading with him. Arion ignored her. He forced open her hand and seized one of the fingers. Dunk stood there stupidly, not quite believing what he saw. Then he heard a crack, and Tanzel screamed. One of Arion's men-at-arms tried to grab him and went flying. 3 long strides, then Dunk grabbed the prince's shoulder and wrenched him around hard. His sword and dagger were forgotten, along with everything the old man had ever taught him. His fist knocked Arion off his feet, and the toe of his boot slammed into the prince's belly. When Arion went for his knife, Dunk stepped on his wrist and kicked him again right in the mouth. He might have kicked him to death right then and there, but the princeling's men swarmed over him. He had a man on each arm and another pounding him across the back. No sooner had he wrestled free from one than 2 more were on him. Finally, they shoved him down and pinned his arms and legs. Arion was on his feet again. The prince's mouth was bloody. He pushed inside with a finger. "You've loosened one of my teeth," he complained, "so we'll start by breaking all of yours." He pushed his hair from his eyes. "You look familiar. You took me for a stable boy." Arion smiled redly. "I recall. You refused to take my horse. Why did you throw your life away? For this whore?" Tanzel was curled up on the ground, cradling her maimed hand. He gave her a shove with the toe of his boot. "She's scarcely worth it." What stands out here is that many of the men-at-arms supporting Arion were helping him to attack the weak. Many of them were likely knights, yet there they were, burning the livelihood of puppeteers, terrorizing them, and allowing their prince to maim one of their hands. It was only Dunk, a man who's never been knighted, who doesn't have the training or privilege of any of them, who stepped up and tried to protect Tanzel and her family. Yet he's asked, by a prince who is definitely a knight, "Why did you throw your life away? For this whore?" Dunk went into danger to protect someone else, even at the expense of his own life. Protecting someone who cannot defend themselves matters more than the consequences. Brienne faces nearly the identical choice in A Feast for Crows. At the inn on the crossroads, a group of armed outlaws arrives, one of them wearing the Hound's helm. Brienne quickly realizes who they are and what they intend to do. There are 7 of them, and only 3 people standing in their way. She understands the odds immediately. Lightning cracked to the south as the riders swung down off their horses. For half a heartbeat, darkness turned to day. An axe gleamed silvery blue. Light shimmered off mail and plate, and beneath the dark hood of the lead rider, Brienne glimpsed an iron snout and rows of iron teeth snarling. Gendry saw it too. Him. No, not him. His helm. Brienne tried to keep the fear from her voice, but her mouth was dry as dust. She had a pretty good notion who wore the Hound's helm. The children, she thought. The door to the inn banged open. Willow stepped out into the rain, a crossbow in her hands. The girl was shouting at the riders. A clap of thunder rolled across the yard, drowning out her words. As it faded, Brienne heard the man in the Hound's helm say, "Loose a squirrel at me and I'll shove that crossbow up your..." expletives? "Then I'll pop your eyes out and make you eat them." The fury in the man's voice drove Willow back a step, trembling. 7, Brienne thought again, despairing. She had no chance against 7, she knew. No chance and no choice. She stepped out into the rain, Oathkeeper in hand. "Leave her be. If you want to essay someone, try me." The outlaws turned as one. One laughed and another said something in a tongue Brienne did not know. The huge one with the broad white face gave a malevolent hiss. The man in the Hound's helm began to laugh. "You're uglier even than I remember. I'd sooner essay your horse." "Horses are what we want," one of the wounded men said. "Fresh horses and some food. There are outlaws after us. Give us your horses and we'll be gone. We won't do you harm." "F that!" The outlaw in the Hound's helm yanked a battle axe off his saddle. "I want to cut her legs off. I'll set her on her stump so she can watch me S.A. the crossbow girl." With what? Taunted Brienne. Shagwell said they cut your manhood off when they took your nose. She meant to provoke him, and it did. Bellowing curses, he came at her, his feet sending up splatters of black water as he charged. The others stood back to watch the show, as she had prayed they might. Brienne stayed as still as stone, waiting. The yard was dark. The mud was slippery underfoot. Better to let him come at me. If the gods are good, he'll slip and fall. The gods were not good, but her sword was. 5 steps, 4 steps. Now, Brienne counted, and Oathkeeper swung up to meet his rush. Steel crashed against steel as her blade bit through his rags and opened a gash in his chainmail. Even as his axe came crashing down at her, she twisted aside, slashing at his chest as she retreated. He followed, staggering and bleeding, roaring rage. Despite Brienne defeating her first challenger, the next man who jumped her was Biter, who was much more brutal, and she had already been tired by that point. Without the intervention of Gendry, she may have been eaten alive, but still she made the choice to put children ahead of herself. The decision both characters make in these moments reveals the core ethic that defines them. A true knight protects the vulnerable even when the odds are hopeless. As noted before, Brienne is Dunk's descendant, but the connections between them obviously extend far beyond that. Throughout the story, Martin links Brienne to Dunk through imagery, symbolism, and character design. One of the most direct examples appears in Brienne's shield. During the events of the Hedge Knight, Dunk commissions a new shield for himself before the tournament at Ashford. When asked what device he once painted on it, he remembers a sunset he had seen the night before and described the design. The result is a shield painted with a tall tree beneath a falling star against a sunset sky. Years later, in A Feast for Crows, Brienne has a design painted using the design she remembered from her father's armory on Tarth. When she describes it to the painter, the imagery is exact. It was more a picture than a proper coat of arms, the green leaves of the tree, and along the path of the falling star. Brienne literally carries Dunk's heraldry into the main series. The connection between them is not only symbolic but physical. Both characters are described as unusually large for their worlds. Dunk is famously tall, so tall that it becomes part of his name. Brienne is also exceptionally tall and broad-shouldered, towering over many of the men she encounters. But Westeros reacts very differently to these traits. Dunk's size makes him impressive. It reinforces the imagery of a powerful knight. Brienne's size, on the other hand, makes her an object of ridicule. She's called ugly, mocked for her appearance, and treated as something unnatural because her body does not fit Westeros' expectations of femininity. In other words, Dunk and Brienne share many of the same physical traits, but those traits produce completely different social reactions. What makes Dunk admirable makes Brienne monstrous and freakish in the eyes of society around her. One commonality between Brienne and Dunk is that both of them serve kings. Brienne becomes Brienne the Blue in Renly's Rainbow Guard. His Rainbow Guard is a form of the King's Guard, but far more colorful. Years prior to that, Dunk served in the King's Guard of Aegon V Targaryen, and even became the Lord Commander. Both of them aspired to these positions, even though society told both of them that they were unworthy. Another subtle connection between Duncan the Tall and Brienne of Tarth appears in their relationships with the boys who become their squires. In the Dunk and Egg novellas, Dunk travels with Egg, the bold boy who eventually becomes King Aegon VI Targaryen. In the main series, Brienne travels with Podrick Payne, a shy and neglected boy who once served as Tyrion Lannister's squire. At first glance, the two pairs seem very similar. In both cases, a young boy begins following a tall warrior who did not originally intend to take a squire. Both Egg and Pod pursue and attach themselves to their chosen knight through persistence rather than formal arrangement, but the similarities quickly reveal a series of interesting reversals. Egg is secretly one of the highest-born children in Westeros. As the son of Prince Maekar Targaryen, he belongs to the royal family, even though he travels incognito with his head shaved and his identity hidden. Even as young as he is, he has a life of training and education that put him at an advantage over any other child and many other adults in that world. Dunk, by contrast, comes from the lowest possible background, a flea-bottom orphan with little education and almost no understanding of noble politics. His training in arms is also very limited, resulting in him relying on his physical strength. Podrick and Brienne reverse that dynamic. Brienne is the daughter of a lord and grew up in a castle with access to training, resources, and education. She is very well trained in physical combat, so she can utilize not only her strength, but also technical martial strategy. Podrick, meanwhile, comes from a poor and declining branch of House Payne. Though technically noble, he has been largely ignored and mistreated throughout his life. In other words, Dunk travels with a prince, while Brienne travels with a boy who has been completely overlooked by the world around him. There is also a difference in their preparation. Egg is already a capable squire when he begins traveling with Dunk. He knows the duties of a squire, understands the customs of knighthood, and has received the kind of training that noble children are expected to have. Podrick, on the other hand, begins Brienne's journey as a deeply uncertain and inexperienced boy. He struggles with even the basic expectations of a squire, though he's eager to learn. Throughout his time traveling with Brienne, he constantly stutters when addressing her, often correcting himself awkwardly as he tries to decide how to refer to her. This often comes out as "Sir, m'lady," as he tries to call her a knight and a lady at the same time. That small hesitation captures something important about Brienne's position in the story. Podrick recognizes her both as a knightly figure and a noblewoman, but Westeros does not have a clear category for someone who occupies both roles. Podrick and Egg serve as a kind of bridge between the two stories. Just as Dunk once guided Egg through the complicated realities of knighthood and honor, Brienne now guides Podrick through the broken aftermath of the same ideals. Another important difference between Duncan the Tall and Brienne of Tarth lies in the worlds they inhabit. Dunk lives in a time where the songs of chivalry seem possible. There are still very harsh realities and gritty realism, but the plots of his stories come around faster to happier endings than hers do. The novellas also take place in the spring and summer, where there are droughts and spring sickness. Brienne lives in the aftermath of his world, where the songs have already begun to fall apart, and it's autumn and winter during her time. These contrasts appear repeatedly in the story, especially in the way Martin uses familiar knightly legends. One of the clearest examples of this involves the story of Florian the Fool and Jonquil. In The Hedge Knight, Dunk encounters this tale during the puppet performance by the Dornish puppeteers. As the puppets dance and speak, the audience hears the familiar lines from the story. "You are not a knight," Jonquil says to the puppet. "You are Florian the Fool." "I am, my lady," Florian replies, kneeling. "As great a fool as ever lived, and as great a knight as well." "A knight and a fool?" she asks. "I have never heard of such a thing." "Sweet lady," Florian answers, "all men are fools, and all men are knights, where women are concerned." In Dunk's story, the legend is light-hearted and romantic. It is also part of the cultural background of the story he travels in, another reminder of the idealized version of knighthood that people still want to believe in. Even so, as in the passage I read earlier, the Florian and Jonquil puppets are burned by Arianne's men. But Dunk is there, having already been subtly referenced as a Florian figure during a flirtatious conversation with Tanselle, to attempt to restore a semblance of knightly valor by coming to her defense. Brienne's story encounters the same legend, but in a far darker form. When she begins searching for Sansa Stark, Brienne believes that Sansa escaped King's Landing with the help of Sir Dantos Hollard. Dantos himself encouraged the romantic interpretation of the legend of Jonquil and Florian by presenting himself to Sansa as Florian after Sansa had helped save his life from Joffrey, who then turned him into a fool. When they meet in secret, Dantos tells her, "The singers say there was another fool once, who was the greatest knight of all. Sweet lady, I would be your Florian." And this, of course, works very well on Sansa. "Florian," she whispered, thinking that the gods have finally answered her prayers. But by the time Brienne begins her search, the reality of the situation is very different. Dantos is already dead, murdered by Littlefinger. As it turns out, he was less Florian the Fool and more of an opportunist, working with Littlefinger to remove Sansa from King's Landing after using her to provide poison to Olenna Tyrell. Once he had outlived his usefulness, he was murdered, and Sansa was taken by Littlefinger into the Vale. So the romantic story Brienne imagines of a maiden fleeing danger with a fool knight protector never actually happened. Brienne repeatedly asks travelers if they have seen a maiden in a fool, and eventually she unfortunately does encounter a fool, just not the fool from the songs or even Dantos. The man she finds is Shagwell, a grotesque and sadistic outlaw who had once been a part of the gang who captured her and Jaime and attempted to SA her. When Brienne finally kills him, the moment is anything but heroic. After killing his companions, she forces Shagwell to dig a grave for the man he murdered. Then she waits. As she knelt to lay the body down, she thought, "The fool will make his try now, whilst my back is turned." She heard his ragged breathing, half a heartbeat before Podrick cried out his warning. Shagwell had a jagged chunk of rock clutched in one hand. Brienne had her dagger up her sleeve. A dagger will beat a rock every time. She knocked aside his arm and punched the steel into his bowels. "Laugh," she snarled at him. He moaned instead. "Laugh," she repeated, grabbing his throat with one hand and stabbing at his belly with the other. "Laugh." She kept saying it over and over, until her hand was red up to the wrist, and the stink of the fool's dying was like to choke her. But Shagwell never laughed. The sobs that Brienne heard were all her own. When she realized that, she threw down her knife and shuddered. The songs of Florian the Fool promise romance and adventure. Brienne's reality turns that image into something monstrous. Another example appears in the famous song The Bear and the Maiden Fair. In the Dunk and Egg stories, the song appears as background entertainment in each of the published novellas. Singers perform it at feasts, traveling performers include it in their acts, and it contributes to the colorful atmosphere of the world Dunk moves in. He even says it's the only song he knows all the way through. But for Brienne, the imagery of that song becomes horrifyingly literal. In A Storm of Swords, she is thrown into a bear pit, wearing a pink dress, and forced to fight the animal for the amusement of the bloody mummers. What is a bawdy joke in the songs becomes a brutal spectacle in reality. The cheerful lyrics about a bear and a maiden transform into something violent and humiliating. Once again, Martin shows the difference between the romantic stories people tell about knighthood and the brutal reality that often lies behind them. Dunk still lives in a world where the songs feel possible on some level, despite the brutality. Brienne lives in a world where those songs are manipulation tools and horrific parody. Another major connection between Duncan the Tall and Brienne of Tarth is in the way their stories reveal the human cost of war. Many of the main POV characters in A Song of Ice and Fire are nobles, knights, and political leaders. Their chapters are focused on battles, strategy, and power struggles. Dunk and Brienne, however, spend much of their time traveling through the countryside among the small folk. Because of this, their stories often reveal how the decisions of the nobles affect the ordinary people who have no control over the conflicts. In The Sworn Sword, Dunk finds himself training a group of peasant levies gathered in the name of Sir Eustace Osgrey. When the men arrive to prepare for training, Dunk quickly realizes how poorly equipped they are. One was too old, two were too young, and one skinny boy turned out to be a skinny girl. The men who remained were hardly soldiers. They bring with them farm tools and crude weapons. Dunk understands immediately that these men have almost no chance against trained knights. Worse, he learns that many of the men who fought in an earlier conflict never returned home. "How did they fare then? How many of them came home with you?" The old knight looked long at him. "Lem," he said at last, "and Pate, and Dake. Dake foraged for us. He was as fine a forager as I ever knew. We never marched on hungry bellies. 3 came back, sir. 3 and me." The character of Dake, who is mentioned here, is a peasant who was killed by Rohan Weber before the novella began. Eustace mentions him foraging and keeping them fed. That foraging likely involved poaching, which likely continued into peacetime as a learned means of survival. The tragic irony is that a skill learned out of desperation, which kept him, Lem, Pate, and Sir Eustace alive, is what resulted in Dake's execution. "Your ladyship rode onto Standfast lands, and did harm to one of Eustace's," said Dunk, before he stopped to think about it. "Did I?" She tugged her braid again. "If you mean the sheep stealer, the man was notorious. I had twice complained to Osgrey, yet he did nothing. I do not ask thrice. The king's laws grant me the power of pit and gallows." These levies are ordinary farmers and laborers, who are being pushed into conflicts that have little to do with them. Despite this, the conflict will result in their deaths, brutalization, and even give them psychological scars. Years later, Brienne travels through a countryside devastated by the War of the Five Kings and encounters the same consequences of those same kinds of wars. One of the most famous passages in A Feast for Crows occurs when Septon Maribald explains the fate of many of the men in what readers now call the Broken Men speech. Maribald describes how ordinary peasants are taken from their home, poorly armed and poorly trained, and marched off to war under the banners of powerful lords. At first they believe in the songs of glory and adventure, but war quickly destroys those illusions. Brothers watch their brothers die, fathers lose their sons. There is never enough to eat. Their shoes fall to pieces from the marching. Eventually, many of those soldiers break psychologically and abandon the armies they were forced to join. The broken man lives from day to day, from meal to meal, more beast than man. The peasants' Dunk trains in the sworn sword represent the beginnings of this process. The broken men Brienne encounters represent its end. Through both characters, Martin reveals the same truth. The wars and petty squabbles fought by kings and lords are paid for by the small folk who have the least power and the most to lose. Because of moments like these, many readers interpret Martin's work as deeply cynical. The series is filled with examples of corruption and betrayal. Knights break their vows, kings abuse their power, wars devastate entire regions and leave innocent people to suffer the consequences. From that perspective, the world of A Song of Ice and Fire can appear relentlessly bleak, but characters like Duncan the Tall and Brienne Tarth complicate that interpretation. Their stories show that even in a brutal and unjust world, goodness cannot simply disappear. Dunk and Brienne are not perfect heroes. They make mistakes, they struggle with doubt, and they often find themselves powerless to stop the larger tragedies unfolding around them. But what defines them is that they continue to choose honor anyway. Dunk risks his life to defend a puppet girl who no one else cares about. Brienne steps forward to face 7 armed outlaws because she refuses to stand by while children are threatened. In many cases, those choices only bring them more suffering, and yet they continue to act in the same principle: a knight defends the innocent. Martin's world may be harsh and often unforgiving, but Dunk and Brienne remind us that the ideals behind knighthood are not entirely illusions. Even in the darkest moments of the story, there are still people who try to live by them. And in a world as harsh as Westeros, that choice, the decision to hold on to honor, even when everything around you suggests that honor is meaningless, is the most heroic act of all. Thanks for listening to the Lore Weaver podcast. If this episode sparked questions or changed how you viewed the text, please feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, or pass this episode along to someone who enjoys thoughtful literary discussion. Until next time, keep reading closely and explore the lore.